The morning sun rose over the 7 hills of Rome on a day in 186 BCE, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of the Aventine district. In a modest dwelling near the Temple of Ceres, a woman named Hispala Facinia stirred from troubled sleep. She was a freedwoman, a former slave, who had purchased her liberty through years of service as a courtesan. Roman law declared her free, a citizen with rights guaranteed by the ancient traditions of the Republic. Yet on this morning, Hispala would discover how hollow that freedom truly was when the state decided it needed something from her. Hispala had committed no crime. She had violated no statute. She had harmed no person. But she possessed knowledge about religious practices occurring in the night, ceremonies dedicated to the god Bacchus that had spread through Rome's population like wildfire. The Senate had grown alarmed. Whispers spoke of orgies, of murders, of conspiracies hatched in torchlit groves. Whether these accusations held truth or stemmed from the fevered imaginations of conservative senators mattered little. The state had decided to act, and Hispala found herself caught in its machinery. The consul Spurius Postumius Albinus summoned her, not with an invitation, not with a request, but with the full compulsion of Roman authority. Hispala was terrified. She knew that the Bacchic cult numbered thousands of initiates, many of them powerful, many of them dangerous. To speak against them meant death, not the clean death of execution, but the silent knife in a dark alley, the poisoned cup at dinner. She begged to be excused, pleaded for protection. The consul listened with the patience of a man who held absolute power and knew it. The protection Hispala received illuminated the true nature of Roman freedom. She was placed under the guardianship of the consul himself, moved to a secured location, her movements monitored for her own safety. In exchange, she became an instrument of the state, compelled to testify, compelled to name names, compelled to participate in the greatest religious persecution Rome had yet witnessed. Her freedom to remain silent did not exist. Her freedom to protect herself from retaliation depended entirely on the goodwill of magistrates who viewed her as a tool. Roman law had made her free, and Roman law had made her servitude complete. The Senator's Consultum de Bacchanalibus that followed in 1986 BCE stands as one of history's clearest demonstrations of how legal freedom can mask political subjugation. The decree, preserved in bronze and discovered near the town of Tiriolo in southern Italy, speaks with the cold precision of bureaucratic terror. Throughout Italy, all Bacchic shrines were to be destroyed. No Roman citizen, no Latin ally, no person of any status was to participate in Bacchic rites without explicit permission from the urban praetor and approval by a Senate quorum of at least 100 members. Gatherings were limited to no more than 5 persons. No man was to serve as priest. No common fund was to be maintained. No oath was to be sworn. The punishment for violation was death. 7,000 people were investigated. Thousands were executed. The exact number vanished into the euphemisms of official records, but the historian Titus Livius, writing generations later, noted that more died from the investigations than from any foreign war of that period. These were Roman citizens protected by laws stretching back centuries. They possessed the rights of provocatio, the sacred appeal to the people against magisterial punishment. They possessed the rights of due process established by the 12 Tables. They possessed all the guarantees that Roman tradition offered its free citizens. None of it mattered. The Senate had declared a state of emergency. In emergencies, Roman law transformed. The very statutes designed to protect citizens became weapons against them. The quaestiones, the investigative tribunals, established to handle the crisis, operated outside normal legal constraints. Accusations required no corroboration. Defense was minimal. The machinery ground forward with terrible efficiency, and citizens discovered that their freedom extended only as far as the state permitted. This was not an aberration. This was the system functioning precisely as designed. 3 centuries before the Bacchanalian persecution, Rome had established the fundamental architecture of citizen freedom. The 12 Tables, inscribed around 40-50 BCE after years of plebeian agitation, represented the first codification of Roman law. The plebeians had demanded written statutes because unwritten custom had been wielded against them by patrician magistrates who interpreted tradition however suited their interests. Written law, the reformers believed, would constrain arbitrary power. The decemviri, the 10 men appointed to draft these tables, laboured for 2 years. They reportedly sent delegations to Athens and other Greek cities to study foreign legal systems. The result was displayed in the forum for all citizens to see: bronze tablets establishing rules for debt, property, inheritance, and legal procedure. Here was freedom made tangible, freedom inscribed in metal, freedom visible to any citizen who could read. Yet the content of those tables revealed how deeply control was embedded in Roman conceptions of liberty. The laws of the 12 tables did not primarily protect citizens from the state. They established the state's authority over every aspect of citizen life, from the power of fathers over children to the regulations governing funerals. Table IV granted the paterfamilias, the male head of household, authority to kill his own children if they were born deformed. Table 8 established that a person who killed another's slave would be punished, but the slave's life was compensated as property damage, not murder. Table X regulated how much mourning women could express, how many flute players could attend a funeral, how much gold could be buried with the dead. The famous Table 11 contained a provision that would echo through centuries of Roman history: the prohibition against intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. This was later repealed, but its very existence demonstrated that Roman law did not merely describe natural rights. Roman law created categories, hierarchies, permissions, and prohibitions. Freedom was not something citizens possessed inherently. Freedom was something the law granted, and what the law granted, the law could revoke. The debt provisions of the 12 tables illustrated this with particular clarity. Table 3 established the process of nexum, debt bondage. A citizen who could not pay his debts could be seized by his creditor, bound in chains weighing no more than 15 pounds, and held for 60 days while attempts were made to settle the debt. If no settlement occurred, the debtor could be sold into slavery across the Tiber, outside Roman territory, because Roman law still preserved the fiction that citizens could not be enslaved within Rome itself. If there were multiple creditors, the law specified, they could cut the debtor's body into pieces proportional to their claims. Scholars have debated whether this dismemberment provision was ever enforced literally. The Roman antiquarian Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century CE, insisted it was meant metaphorically, referring to the division of the debtor's labour or property. But whether literal or figurative, the provision stated a fundamental truth: the Roman citizen's body belonged to the law. The citizen was free, yes, free as the law defined freedom, which meant subject to the law's total jurisdiction over life, labour, and death. The Nexium provisions were eventually modified by the Lex Poetilia of 326 BCE, which supposedly abolished debt bondage for citizens who had not explicitly agreed to it. This reform came only after a scandal involving a young citizen named Gaius Publilius, who had been held in bondage by his father's creditor, a man named Lucius Papirius. The creditor, according to Livius, had attempted to sexually assault the young man. Public outrage led to legal reform, but the reform did not eliminate the principle. It merely refined it. Citizens could still be bound for debt, they simply had to have consented to the arrangement. The state had not withdrawn its authority over citizen bodies. The state had merely required that citizens formally acknowledge that authority. Freedom remained a legal category, created and defined by statutes, dependent on state recognition, revocable through state procedure. The Roman taxation system developed over centuries into an apparatus of remarkable sophistication, and it demonstrated with particular clarity how freedom could coexist with comprehensive state extraction. The censors, magistrates elected every 5 years, conducted the census that formed the basis of both taxation and military obligation. Every Roman citizen was required to appear, to declare his property, to submit to official assessment. The penalties for failure to register were severe: loss of citizenship, seizure of property, even enslavement. The system was called tributum, a direct tax on citizen property assessed according to wealth. Wealthier citizens paid more, poorer citizens paid less. This appeared progressive, even fair, but the purpose of tributum was not civic welfare in any modern sense. The revenue funded military campaigns that enriched the aristocracy through conquest while draining the small farmers who supplied the legion's manpower. A citizen might pay taxes for 20 years to fund wars in Spain or Africa, watch his sons march away to fight, see his farm fall into debt because there was no one to work the land, and ultimately lose everything to creditors who had profited from the same wars that ruined him. The publicani system made this extraction both more efficient and more brutal. The Roman state did not collect its own taxes in the provinces. Instead, it auctioned tax farming contracts to private companies, usually organized by wealthy equestrians. These publicani paid the state a fixed sum and then extracted whatever they could from the provincial populations. The difference was their profit. The abuses were systematic. Gaius Verres, governor of Sicily from 73 to 71 BCE, became notorious for his rapacity, but his crimes were distinguished more by their scale than their nature. Verres worked hand in glove with the publicani, allowing them to assess grain taxes at rates far exceeding legal limits, seizing the property of communities that could not pay, executing provincial officials who protested. When he was finally prosecuted by Marcus Tullius Cicero, the evidence filled multiple volumes. Yet Verres had merely done more openly what governors routinely did discreetly. The Sicilians who suffered under Verres were not Roman citizens. They were provincials, subjects of Rome's empire. But the system that enabled his crimes had been perfected on Roman citizens themselves. The tributum, the census, the legal apparatus of property registration and tax assessment. All of it created the infrastructure that made extraction possible. Citizens were numbered, categorized, assessed, and taxed. Their property was known to the state. Their obligations were recorded. Their persons were available for military service. Freedom, in this context, meant being documented in the state's records rather than existing outside them. The reform of Gaius Gracchus in 1923 BCE attempted to constrain publicani abuses by establishing permanent courts to try cases of extortion in the provinces. The Quaestio de Repetundis was meant to allow provincials to sue Roman officials for illegal exactions. In practice, the courts were staffed by equestrians, the same class that dominated the publicani companies. Convictions were rare. The reform created the appearance of accountability while preserving the reality of impunity. Gracchus himself understood this dynamic better than most. His broader reform program sought to redistribute public land to poor citizens, establish colonies for the landless, and subsidize grain prices in Rome. These measures challenged the economic interests that dominated Roman politics. In 121 BCE, the Senate declared a Senatus Consultum Ultimum against Gracchus and his supporters, the same emergency decree that would later be used against the Catilinarian conspirators. In the violence that followed, Gracchus died, either by his own hand or by a loyal slave who killed him at his request. 3,000 of his supporters were executed without trial. The legal freedom of Roman citizens had not protected Gaius Gracchus. His status as a tribune, with its sacred inviolability supposedly guaranteed by ancient oath, had not protected him. The Senate had simply declared that protecting the Republic required his death, and the Republic's protection meant whatever the Senate decided it meant. Military service formed the most direct expression of the state's claim on citizen bodies. The Roman levy, the dilectus, was not a request. Citizens of military age who possessed the minimum property qualification were obligated to serve when called. Failure to appear was desertion. Desertion was punishable by death, sale into slavery, or loss of citizenship. The citizen who wished to remain a citizen submitted to state authority over his body, his labor, and potentially his life. The obligations were not light. A citizen could be required to serve for up to 16 years in the infantry or 10 years in the cavalry. He provided his own equipment, scaled to his wealth. The poorest citizens served as velites light infantry with javelins. Wealthier citizens served as hastati, principes, or triarii, with heavier armor and better weapons. The richest citizens served as cavalry, providing their own horses. This system persisted, with modifications, from the early Republic through the reforms of Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century BCE, the experience of service-bound citizens to state authority in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. Military discipline was absolute. The centurions who commanded the centuries carried vine staffs called vites, which they used freely on soldiers who displeased them. Punishment for serious offences included fustuarium, beating to death by one's fellow soldiers, and decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a unit that had shown cowardice. Polybius, the Greek historian who lived as a hostage in Rome during the 2nd century BCE and befriended the Scipio family, described the Roman military system in extensive detail. He was impressed by its efficiency, its discipline, its capacity to transform diverse Italian populations into a unified fighting force. What impressed him most was the totality of Roman authority over the soldier-citizen. The Romans, Polybius wrote, are most severe in the matter of military offences. The severity served purposes beyond military effectiveness. The soldier who submitted to the vine staff's discipline, who watched comrades executed for sleeping on watch, who lived for years under the absolute authority of his commanders, internalized a relationship to state power that did not end when he returned to civilian life. The levy was not merely a method of raising armies. It was a system of citizen formation, teaching Romans that their bodies belonged to the state and that the state's authority over them was total. The property requirement for military service theoretically protected the poorest citizens from this obligation. Those who owned nothing had nothing to defend and thus owed nothing to the state. This logic was embedded in the census system, which classified citizens into classes based on wealth and assessed both taxation and military obligation accordingly. The proletari, citizens who possessed no property, were excluded from the levy and counted only for their capacity to produce children. Proles, offspring, who might one day become property holders and thus proper citizens. But this exclusion was itself a form of control. The proletary existed outside the full benefits of citizenship, while remaining subject to citizen obligations in other respects. They could be conscripted in emergencies, as they were during the desperate days of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal's army ravaged Italy. They could be enrolled in the navy, where service conditions were even harsher than in the legions. Their exclusion from normal military service did not mean freedom from state claims on their bodies. It meant that the state exercised those claims through different mechanisms. The reforms of Gaius Marius in 197 BCE transformed this system by eliminating the property requirement for military service. Marius enrolled the proletari in his legions, armed them at state expense, and created a professional army that looked to its commander rather than the Senate for rewards and advancement. This has traditionally been presented as a democratizing reform, opening military service and its benefits to Rome's poorest citizens. The consequences told a different story. The Marian army created soldiers whose primary loyalty was to their general, who depended on their general for land grants after service, who would follow their general against the state if necessary. The civil wars that tore the Republic apart over the following century were fought by armies of Roman citizens against armies of Roman citizens, each side legally authorized by some faction of the government, each side composed of men who had accepted state authority over their bodies and labor. Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched on Rome twice, in 88 and 83 BCE, leading Roman legions against the city whose authority those legions supposedly served. He established himself as dictator, published proscription lists that condemned thousands to death, redistributed the property of the proscribed to his supporters, and reshaped Roman law to concentrate power in the Senate. All of this was technically legal. Sulla held properly authorized magistracies, passed laws through proper procedures, observed proper forms. The fact that he had seized power through military force and maintained it through terror did not invalidate the legal character of his regime. Roman law was flexible enough to accommodate dictatorship, as readily as it accommodated liberty. The prescriptions of Sulla demonstrated with terrible clarity what Roman citizenship actually protected. The lists posted in the forum named thousands of Roman citizens who were thereby condemned to death. Their property was forfeit to the state. Anyone who killed them could claim a reward. Anyone who sheltered them became guilty of a capital crime. The proscribed had no recourse, no trial, no appeal. Their names on the list was sufficient for their legal execution. Gaius Marius the Younger, son of the great reformer, was among the proscribed. Marcus Marius Gratidianus, a praetor who had been popular with the common people, was among the proscribed. Quintus Lucretius of Fella, who had commanded Sulan forces during the siege of Praeneste, was among the proscribed, added to the list when he announced his intention to run for consul without Sulla's permission. The citizenship that supposedly guaranteed these men rights offered them nothing when the state decided their deaths served its purposes. The transformation of the Republic into the Principate under Augustus refined rather than eliminated these dynamics. Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, emerged from decades of civil war as the sole ruler of the Roman world. He held power through military force, having defeated all rivals and established control over every legion. Yet he did not present himself as a monarch. He was the princeps, the first citizen, distinguished from other citizens only by his auctoritas, his prestige and authority. The legal fiction was elaborate and remarkably effective. Augustus held traditional republican magistracies, consul, tribune, pontifex maximus. He received specific grants of authority through proper senatorial and popular procedures. The laws he promulgated followed established forms. The courts continued to function. Citizens continued to possess their traditional rights. Everything appeared continuous with the Republic, and this appearance was itself a form of control. The reality was that all power flowed from Augustus and could be exercised only with his permission. The Senate met, deliberated, and passed decrees, but the decrees reflected the emperor's will. Magistrates were elected, but the candidates were those Augustus approved. Citizens voted, but the votes ratified predetermined outcomes. The appearance of freedom persisted. The substance had vanished. Augustus's social legislation illustrated how imperial power could reshape citizen life while maintaining libertarian rhetoric. The Lex Julia Dimeritandis Ordinibus of 18 BCE and the Lex Papia Popia of 9 CE created an elaborate system of marriage incentives and penalties. Citizens who married and produced children received legal privileges, priority in holding office. Citizens who remained unmarried or childless faced legal disabilities, restrictions on inheritance, exclusion from public spectacles, liability for special taxation. The laws were framed as moral reform, as restoration of traditional values supposedly corrupted during the Civil War era. Augustus presented himself as the guardian of Roman morality, the restorer of ancestral virtue. The legislation punished adultery as a criminal offense for the first time in Roman history, empowering husbands and fathers to kill adulterous daughters and establishing exile as the standard punishment for convicted adulteresses. The state had inserted itself into the most intimate aspects of citizen life. Marriage, which had been primarily a private arrangement between families, became a public obligation monitored by officials and enforced through legal sanctions. Reproduction, previously a family matter, became a civic duty with state-mandated consequences for failure to perform it. Augustus was literally legislating that Roman citizens must breed, using the language of freedom to justify unprecedented intrusion into domestic relations. Augustus's own family demonstrated the law's selective application. His daughter Julia was convicted of adultery and exiled to a barren island, stripped of luxuries, forbidden to drink wine or receive male visitors. Her crime was real enough. She had conducted affairs with multiple prominent men, possibly including Iulus Antonius, son of Mark Antony. But her prosecution served political purposes beyond moral enforcement. Julia's lovers included men who might have served as alternative centers of power. Her disgrace eliminated them as threats. The poet Publius Ovidius Naso was exiled in 8 CE, the same year Julia's daughter was exiled for similar offences. The exact reasons for Ovid's banishment remain unclear. He wrote only of a poem and an error, but his work had certainly offended Augustan morality. The Ars Amatoria, published around 1 BCE, was essentially a manual for seduction, teaching Roman men how to pursue affairs with married women. This directly contradicted the moral program Augustus had legally mandated. Ovid was not tried or convicted. He was simply relegated, a form of punishment that avoided formal legal process while achieving the same result. Augustus, as holder of tribunician power, could exercise authority without observing procedural constraints. The poet who had celebrated freedom in love spent his remaining decade in Tomis on the Black Sea frontier, writing verses pleading for forgiveness that never came. The provincial system extended these dynamics across the Mediterranean world. Conquered peoples were not enslaved en masse. Rome found indirect control more effective than direct bondage. Instead, the provincials were subjected to legal categories that defined their relationship to Roman authority with precision. They were peregrini, foreigners whose rights existed only as Roman law chose to recognize them. The Edict of the Praetor Peregrinus, the magistrate who handled legal matters involving non-citizens, established the framework. The praetor announced at the beginning of his year in office how he would adjudicate disputes, what principles he would apply, what remedies he would offer. This created something like a legal system for non-citizens, but it was a system entirely dependent on Roman authority. The praetor could change his edict, his successor could change it further. Provincials had no permanent rights, only the temporary protections that current policy afforded. The Latinita system offered a middle status between citizen and foreigner. Latins possessed some Roman rights. The ius commercii, the right to engage in Roman commercial law, and sometimes the ius connubii, the right to contract legally recognized marriages with citizens, but not others. They could become citizens through various mechanisms, most commonly by holding local magistracies or by service in the auxiliary forces. This created a hierarchy of aspiration, encouraging provincials to seek Roman approval through service to Roman interests. The extension of citizenship, when it came, illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of Roman inclusion. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, issued by the Emperor Caracalla, granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. This appeared to be a great democratizing measure, the final expansion of Roman freedom to encompass all Roman subjects. The historian Cassius Dio, himself a Roman senator who benefited from the extension, offered a more cynical interpretation. Caracalla's motive, Dio wrote, was primarily fiscal. Roman citizens paid certain inheritance taxes that non-citizens did not. By extending citizenship, Caracalla expanded the tax base. Freedom became taxation. Inclusion became extraction. The Constitutio Antoniniana also demonstrated how citizenship had changed. In the early republic, citizenship had meant participation in assemblies, voting on laws, electing magistrates, exercising meaningful political voice. By 212 CE, none of this existed. The assemblies had ceased to function centuries earlier. Magistrates were imperial appointments. Laws were imperial pronouncements. Citizenship conferred legal protections and legal obligations, but it no longer conferred political power. Roman citizens across the empire were equally subject to imperial authority, equally bound by imperial law, equally free in ways that mattered less and less. The legal system that emerged over Roman history created categories of extraordinary sophistication. The Roman jurists, particularly those of the classical period from the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, elaborated doctrines that continue to influence legal thinking today. Property law, contract law, inheritance law, the law of persons, all receive detailed analysis and systematic organization. The Digest of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century from centuries of juristic writing, remains one of the great monuments of legal thought. Yet this sophistication served particular purposes. The law of property established rules for acquisition, transfer, and protection of ownership that facilitated commerce and protected wealth. The law of contract created enforceable mechanisms for commercial agreements that enabled long-distance trade and complex financial arrangements. The law of inheritance ensured that property accumulated by one generation could pass to the next, preserving and concentrating wealth within families. The law of persons categorized human beings into types: citizens and non-citizens, free and slave, sunt euirauri, those sui juris, of their own right, possessed full legal capacity to own property, make contracts, and appear in court. Those alieni iuris, of another's right, existed under the authority of a paterfamilias and possessed limited legal capacity. Women, even if sui iuris after their father's death, required tutors for significant legal transactions. Slavery was the foundation of this system. The Roman economy depended on slave labor. In the fields, in the mines, in the workshops, in the households. The jurists analyzed slavery with the same careful attention they brought to other legal categories. A slave was a thing, a res, an item of property that could be bought, sold, inherited, or destroyed at the owner's will. A slave could not own property, make valid contracts, or marry in the eyes of the law. The slave's labor, the slave's body, the slave's children, all belonged to the owner. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century CE, noted that the power of masters over slaves existed in all nations and at all times. He was observing, accurately, that slavery was universal in the ancient world, but he was also naturalizing what was in fact a legal construction. Roman law created the category of slavery, defined its incidence, regulated its operation. The law determined who could be enslaved, how manumission could occur, what disabilities freed persons suffered. Slavery existed because the law created it and maintained it. The number of slaves in Roman Italy at the empire's height may have reached 2 million, perhaps a third of the population. They worked the estates of the wealthy, staffed the bureaucracies of government, served in the households of modest citizens. Their presence was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that Romans rarely questioned the institution's justice. Seneca the Younger, the Stoic philosopher, advised treating slaves kindly because they were fellow human beings, but he never suggested freeing them as a class or abolishing the institution that subjected them. The freedom that Roman citizens celebrated was defined against this backdrop of mass unfreedom. To be a citizen was to be not a slave. The privileges of citizenship, protection from arbitrary punishment, rights to trial, the possibility of political participation, gain their meaning from the contrast with slavery's total subjection. Freedom was not an inherent human condition, but a legal status, created by law, maintained by law, dependent on law. This meant that the line between freedom and slavery could be crossed. Citizens could be enslaved through debt bondage, through capture in war, through legal condemnation. Slaves could become citizens through manumission, joining the ranks of freed persons who bore certain disabilities but possessed citizenship's core protections. The fluidity reinforced the lesson. Freedom was the state's gift, not nature's endowment. The criminal law developed mechanisms of astonishing cruelty, justified through procedural formalism. The questiones perpetui, the permanent criminal courts established in the late Republic, handled major offences: murder, extortion, treason, electoral bribery. They employed juries of senators or equestrians, heard advocates argue cases, observed procedural requirements. They appeared to embody rule of law, protection of citizens through formal process. But the penalties these courts imposed ignored the pain they caused. Execution took various forms, from the relatively quick beheading available to citizens of high status to the agonizing crucifixion reserved for slaves and the lowest criminals. The convicted faced exile, which meant loss of citizenship, confiscation of property, permanent separation from family and homeland. The convicted faced the mines, particularly the metal mines of Spain and Egypt, where conditions were so brutal that condemnation was effectively a delayed death sentence. The Lex Porcia, passed in the 2nd century BCE, supposedly protected Roman citizens from corporal punishment without trial. The Lex Sempronia of Gaius Gracchus reinforced this protection. These laws became centerpieces of republican constitutional mythology, symbols of citizen liberty against arbitrary power. Marcus Tullius Cicero invoked them when prosecuting Verres for executing Roman citizens in Sicily without trial. Yet the law's protections were always conditional. Citizens could be flogged and executed under military discipline. Citizens could be punished summarily during states of emergency. Citizens could be relegated by the emperor without formal process. The protections existed, but the exceptions devoured them. The treatment of the Catilinarian conspirators in 63 BCE demonstrated the limits of citizen rights. Lucius Sergius Catilina had allegedly organized a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic, planning to murder consuls, burn the city, and seize power. The conspiracy was revealed through informants, letters were intercepted, and several conspirators were arrested in Rome while Catiline himself fled to raise an army in Etruria. The Senate debated what to do with the arrested conspirators. They were Roman citizens of high status. The laws clearly required that they be tried before the people, before suffering capital punishment. But the consul Cicero argued that the conspirators had, through their treason, forfeited their citizenship. As hostes, public enemies, they could be executed without the normal protections. The Senate agreed, passing the Senatus Consultum Ultimum that authorized Cicero to act. The executions took place in the Tullianum, the ancient prison beneath the Capitoline Hill. The condemned men Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, Gaius Cornelius Cethegus, Lucius Statilius, Publius Gabinius Capito, and Marcus Caeparius were strangled by the public executioner. Cicero announced their deaths to the crowd gathered outside with a single word: Vixerunt. They have lived. It was done. Cicero later faced exile for these executions when political winds shifted. The tribune Publius Clodius Pulcher passed a law in 58 BCE banishing anyone who had put Roman citizens to death without trial. Cicero fled before the law could be applied to him, remaining in exile until recalled the following year. The episode demonstrated that even magistrates who violated citizen rights might face consequences, but also that the law could be used to pursue personal vendettas. That exile could be imposed through legislation rather than trial, that the Republic's protections were ultimately political rather than legal. The empire that emerged from the Republic's ruins maintained legal forms while concentrating real power. The emperor controlled the armies. The emperor appointed provincial governors. The emperor's pronouncements had the force of law. The emperor dispensed patronage, promoted favorites, eliminated rivals. Everything depended on the emperor's will, and the emperor's will was subject to no formal constraint. The good emperors, Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, exercised power with relative moderation, respecting senatorial dignity, consulting before deciding, maintaining legal procedures. But their moderation was a choice, not a requirement. Nothing in the constitutional structure prevented tyranny. When bad emperors came to power, Caligula, Nero, Domitian, there was no legal mechanism to remove them. They could be assassinated, as all three were, but assassination was not a legal remedy. It was a failure of law, a resort to violence because law offered nothing. The reign of Domitian, from 81 to 96 CE, demonstrated how imperial power could corrupt every aspect of legal administration. Domitian became increasingly suspicious of opposition, increasingly ready to see treason in trivial offences. Senators were executed for minor slights. Philosophers were expelled from Rome for teachings that might encourage tyrannicide. The emperor's informers, the dreaded delatores, found treason everywhere, motivated by the share of confiscated property they received as reward. The historian Tacitus, who served as a senator under Domitian, wrote of this period with controlled fury. The Senate, he observed, had competed in servility, praising actions they knew to be wicked, condemning men they knew to be innocent. The senators were free, legally free, politically prominent, wealthy beyond the dreams of ordinary citizens, and their freedom meant nothing against imperial terror. "We should have lost memory itself with voice," Tacitus wrote, "Had it been as much in our power to forget as to be silent." Tacitus's father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, had governed Britain with distinction, extending Roman power further north than any predecessor. His success made him dangerous in Domitian's eyes. Upon Agricola's return to Rome, he received no further commands, no further honours. He retired into private life, avoided public attention, and died in 93 CE. Rumours circulated that he had been poisoned by imperial agents, though Tacitus claimed not to believe them. Whether murdered or merely destroyed through enforced obscurity, Agricola's fate demonstrated what distinguished service won under a suspicious emperor. The legal profession that developed in Rome elaborated concepts of remarkable precision and durability. The jurists distinguished between ius civile, the law specific to Roman citizens, and ius gentium, the law common to all peoples. They distinguished between dominium, ownership, and possessio, possession. They analyzed obligations into categories, contracts, delicts, and various quasi-contractual and quasi-delictual arrangements. Their work created an intellectual architecture that would shape Western law for 2 millennia. But this architecture served the powerful. Access to legal knowledge was expensive. The jurists who elaborated doctrine were aristocrats, men of senatorial or equestrian rank, who studied law as part of their general education and offered opinions to those who consulted them. The poor might know that law existed, might even know some of its basic principles, but could not afford the representation that would make their rights effective. The formulary procedure that governed Roman litigation required technical precision that only experts could navigate. A plaintiff had to select the correct formula, state his claim in proper language, meet procedural requirements exactly. Error was fatal. The wrong formula meant losing the case regardless of the underlying merits. This created demand for legal experts, for formulae sellers, for the elaborate apparatus of Roman litigation that surrounded simple disputes with layers of formalism. The development of cognitio extraordinaria under the empire simplified procedure in some respects, but concentrated power in others. The magistrate now controlled the entire process, from initial hearing through final judgment. Jury trials disappeared. The official decided facts and law, heard evidence and arguments, issued judgment according to his own assessment. This was more flexible than the formulary system, but also more subject to corruption, favoritism, and abuse. The jurist Ulpian, writing in the early 3rd century CE, offered what became one of the most famous formulations in legal history. Iustitia est constans et perpetua voluntas ius suum quaeque tribuens. Justice is the constant and perpetual will to render to each his due. This definition appeared in the opening sections of Justinian's Digest, transmitted through medieval manuscripts, analysed by generations of legal theorists, repeated to this day in discussions of law's purposes. But the Roman system that Ulpian served rendered to each according to status, according to wealth, according to power. The dues of a slave differed from the dues of a citizen. The dues of a humble provincial differed from the dues of a senator. Justice meant giving people what the law said they deserved, and what the law said they deserved depended on who they were. Ulpian himself was eventually murdered by the Praetorian Guard, killed in the palace where he served as a senior advisor, another victim of the political violence that defined Roman governance. The late empire developed legal constraints on citizen freedom that earlier periods would have found astonishing. The diocesan reforms of Diocletian, beginning in 284 CE, reorganized provincial administration, created new layers of bureaucracy, and established a taxation system of unprecedented intrusiveness. Citizens were bound to their occupations, forbidden to leave their trades, required to ensure that their children followed them in their callings. This was done in the name of imperial order, of ensuring that essential services continued, of maintaining the structures that kept the empire functioning. The colli, tenant farmers who worked the estates of the wealthy, found themselves bound to the land. Laws prohibited them from leaving, required that they be sold together with the property they farmed, made them essentially serfs while maintaining the fiction that they remained free persons. The distinction between colonus and slave blurred to the point of irrelevance. Both were bound, both were subject, both existed for the benefit of masters and state. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, continued these restrictions while adding new ones. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE proclaimed religious tolerance, ending the persecution of Christians that had marked previous reigns. This appeared to expand freedom, to recognize that citizens could worship according to their consciences. But Constantine also began the process of making Christianity the state religion, which would eventually mean that religious dissent became political crime. By the late 4th century, Theodosius I was legislating against pagan worship, prohibiting sacrifices, ordering temples closed. The religious freedom that Constantine had proclaimed lasted only as long as religious diversity remained politically useful. Once Christianity became dominant, once the state no longer needed to balance competing religious communities, the apparatus of religious enforcement emerged. Heretics faced civil disabilities, confiscation of property, exile, and eventually death. The transformation was complete. Roman law had begun as a system of citizen self-governance, its statutes passed by assemblies, its magistrates elected by the people. It had evolved into a tool of imperial administration, its rules proclaimed by emperors, its enforcement dependent on bureaucratic machinery. The freedom that Roman tradition celebrated, the libertas that orators invoked, that historians praised, that philosophers analyzed, had been revealed as a conditional grant from rulers who could revoke it at will. The final centuries of the Western Roman Empire presented a spectacle of legal forms persisting while the substance they supposedly protected crumbled. The emperors at Ravenna issued edicts, appointed magistrates, maintained courts. The law continued to be elaborated, compiled, transmitted, but the imperial authority that gave law its force was collapsing. Challenged by military commanders who made and unmade emperors, by Germanic generals who held real power regardless of their official status, by provincial populations who no longer saw Roman rule as either legitimate or effective. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE by the Germanic general Odoacer. The event was scarcely noted by contemporaries. It seemed merely another coup in a long series of coups. What had ended was not the Roman Empire. That continued in the East for another millennium, but the particular configuration of power that had called itself Western. The laws remained, preserved in compilations, studied by bishops who maintained what learning survived, applied in modified forms by the Germanic kingdoms that replaced imperial administration. The Code of Justinian, compiled in the 530 SCE in Constantinople, represented the final systematization of classical Roman law. It gathered imperial edicts from Hadrian forward, organizing centuries of legislation into a usable whole. The digest compiled the opinions of the classical jurists, preserving writings that would otherwise have been lost, transmitting the intellectual heritage of Roman legal thought to future generations. The institutes provided an introductory textbook explaining basic principles for law students. This compilation became the foundation of Western legal tradition. Medieval Europe rediscovered Justinian's texts in the 11th century, studied them in the new universities, used them as the basis for both ecclesiastical and secular law. The categories Roman jurists had created, property, contract, delict, family, inheritance, shaped how Europeans thought about legal relationships. The procedures Roman courts had developed influenced how European courts operated. The principles Roman law had articulated, what Ulpian had called the precepts of law, live honestly, injure no one, render to each his due, became maxims taught to law students across the continent. But the legal tradition thus transmitted carried within it the assumptions that had shaped Roman practice. Law created categories, not merely recognized them. Freedom was a status, not an inherent condition. The state's authority extended to every aspect of citizen life. Rights existed because law established them and endured only as long as the law maintained them. These assumptions, embedded in legal language and procedure and doctrine, persisted long after the specific contexts that had generated them had vanished. The story of Roman law is ultimately a story of how freedom can be defined, constrained and undermined through the very systems meant to protect it. The Roman citizen who took pride in his liberty, who traced his freedom to the ancient struggles between plebeians and patricians, who celebrated the laws that supposedly protected him from arbitrary power, this citizen was enmeshed in a system that claimed his body for military service, his property for taxation, his conduct for moral regulation, his very thoughts for scrutiny in times of emergency. The genius of Roman law was its capacity to present this comprehensive subjection as freedom's safeguard. The citizen was free because he was documented, categorized, assessed, and tracked. He was free because the law specified what he could do and punished what he could not. He was free because his relationship to the state was defined by statutes rather than personal whim, statutes that could be changed, exceptions that could be created, emergencies that could be declared, but always through proper procedure, always with legal form. His Palafacenia, the freedwoman who testified against the Bacchic cult in 198-6 BCE, learned what Roman freedom meant when the state required her cooperation. She spoke because the state compelled her to speak. She lived because the state protected her life. Her freedom was real. She was no longer a slave, no longer property to be bought and sold, but her freedom existed within a system that could mobilize her service whenever that service was needed. The thousands who died in the Bacchanalian persecution, the thousands more who died in Sulla's proscriptions, the citizens enslaved for debt, the soldiers bound to their legions, the colony bound to their land, the subjects bound to their trades, all of these were caught in the same system. Roman law created their freedom by defining its limits. Roman law protected their rights by specifying what rights they possessed. Roman law made them citizens by making them available for the state's use. The modern inheritors of Roman legal tradition have grappled with this legacy in various ways. Some have sought to distinguish between Rome's theoretical commitments and its practical failures, salvaging principles while condemning applications. Some have traced alternative traditions, common law, natural rights, constitutional limits on state power that supposedly escaped Rome's statist assumptions. Some have embraced the Roman model explicitly, finding in comprehensive state authority the guarantor of order and stability. What remains constant is the insight that Roman experience provides, that legal systems shape the freedom they claim to protect, that rights exist within frameworks of power that determine their meaning, that the liberty citizens celebrate may be the very mechanism of their subjection. The illusion of freedom was Rome's greatest legal achievement. The citizens who believed themselves free, who fought for their rights, who celebrated their laws, who trusted their constitution, these citizens sustained a system that used their belief to bind them ever more tightly. The bronze tablet that preserved the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus was discovered in 1640, buried near a road in southern Italy. For nearly 2 millennia, it had lain in the earth, waiting to tell its story of persecution conducted through proper channels, terror administered according to procedure, freedom redefined as the state's permission for citizens to exist. The artifact survived. The thousands who died did not. Documented in Livius's history, remembered in the scholarly tradition, speak to what Roman freedom finally meant, the right to be subject to law rather than subject to individual masters, to belong to the state rather than to a person, to be free as the law defined freedom, and only as the law defined it. This was Rome's gift to Western civilization. Not merely specific rules about property and contract and procedure, but an entire way of thinking about law's relationship to human life. That gift continues to shape how societies organize themselves, how states assert authority, how citizens understand their position within systems too vast and complex for any individual to grasp entirely. The illusion persists, the law continues, and in every legal system that draws on Roman heritage, the tension between proclaimed liberty and actual subjection remains, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, the permanent condition of citizens who believe themselves free because the law tells them they are.